Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Ohioana Book Festival. I'm Steve Abbott, and I'm pleased to welcome you to panel discussion, Seeing the World in Verse. We'd like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana Library website. And special thanks to our official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. You can get copies of all the books featured at the festival by going online to bookloft.com. And now I'm pleased to welcome our authors. And I'll start with Pamela Anderson. She grew up in Ohio's Steel Valley and has worked as a ghostwriter, a grant writer, and a fundraiser for public radio. Her chapbook, Just the Girls, A Kaleidoscope of Butterflies, A Drift of Honeybees, was published by the Poetry Box in 2020. Finishing Line Press published her chapbook, Widowmaker, last year, and Kelsey Books, Daffy Down Dilly Press, published her poems for children, The Galloping Garbage Truck. Much of her writing focuses on the Holocaust and her father's World War II service in the 82nd Airborne, and her Holocaust poem, My Brother's Coat, won an AWP Intro Journals Project Award. Her poetry has appeared in Jenny Mag, Atticus Review, and elsewhere. She's a graduate of the Northeast Ohio MFA program. Welcome, Pamela.
Thanks.
William Heath was born in Youngstown and grew up in the nearby town of Poland. He attended Hiram College and Case Western Reserve University and has a PhD in American Studies. He's taught at several colleges, including Kenyon and Mount St. Mary's University, where he is a professor emeritus. He has published 2 chapbooks, Night Moves in Ohio and Leaving Seville, 2 books of poems, The Walking Man and Steel Valley Elegy, 3 novels, a work of history, William Wells and the Struggle for the Old Northwest, and it was a winner of 2 Spur Awards, and a collection of interviews, Collections with Robert Stone. Welcome, William. Kip Knott had a debut full-length collection of poetry, Tragedy, Ecstasy, Doom, and so on, published in 2020 by Kelsey Books. His second full-length collection of poetry, Clean Coal Burn, also from Kelsey Books, has just been released. His writing and photography have appeared in numerous journals and magazines, both in the US and abroad. He's a monthly contributor to Versification and has received grants from the Ohio Arts Council in both poetry and playwriting, and is also the author of 4 poetry chapbooks, The Weight of Smoke, Whisper Gallery, Everyday Elegies, and Afraid of Heaven. He teaches composition and literature at Columbus State Community College. Well, our question is, we're looking at the world in verse, and certainly poetry historically has served as a way for people to, in a sense, seek calm and beauty. And we've certainly seen the change in that over the past century, particularly the past 70 years or so, as modern poetry came about and more personal and oftentimes more directly political poems started to come into the fore in terms of the nation's poetry. So let's talk about those forms. Bill, you said in your one of your creating writing syllabi that poetry is based on the fact that words have musical qualities. And unlike prose, it's written in poetic lines, which are crafted to enhance that music. Can you talk a little bit about that and perhaps link it into your view of other forms of poetry?
Sure. Because I don't write in rhyme, as I'm sure some of the other poets don't, a lot of people assume, well, if it doesn't rhyme, it's not musical. But of course, poetry has a variety of resources, as certainly the people in this panel know, of assonance and consonance and alliteration and scansion and the rest of it. And so I think poets have to be fully aware of the music of their words, that language has a musical quality, and that the poetic line matters, at least it does to me. And so I'm very interested in how a poem moves down the page as opposed to how it moves across. And of course, the music that it generates. So this music can be rich or it can be muted, but it needs to be there. Another of my favorite quotes by C.S. Lewis is, in order to write a great love poem, it may or may not be necessary to have been in love, but you must love language. And so for me, that's a measure of how poets operate.
And all three of you have written poems that people who are looking for beauty and uplift might look at and say, but this is so political. So all of you have written about current events or about events that have political qualities to them. So Pam, do you want to talk about that? I mean, you're talking about, certainly in some of your writing, you've talked about your father's experiences in World War II and the Holocaust, which a lot of people would look at and say, well, I don't read poetry to see that kind of thing. Can you talk about that from your perspective?
Yes, and even the book Widowmaker, which was published last year by Finishing Line Press, that book is about my husband's multiple cardiac arrests and how he experienced that and then recovered from it. And what I find with poetry, whether it's the Holocaust or a big issue like this medical situation with my husband and my father's World War II experiences, these are giant things. And I can't really wrap my arms around the bigness, the significance of, for example, what's happening in the Ukraine right now. It is too big. And so what I need to do is shrink it down to a small thing that kind of represents that bigger experience, which is why I love poetry. I can take each poem can represent or stand for a little piece of it that helps me gain this bigger understanding, so I'm not so overwhelmed by tragedy or tough experiences. I find it's just a way for me to contain it and then move on from it.
So to kind of take the enormity of something and tighten the focus on it so that it's accessible. Yep.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to write a lot about the Appalachian region of Ohio, which is where I spent a lot of time growing up. It's where my family's from, and that area just lends itself to talking about bigger issues on a smaller scale, because Perry County, Ohio, so it's a perfect example. It's economically one of the poorest counties in Ohio, has one of the highest opioid addiction rates in the country. Unemployment is sky high there. The coal industry is gone. Issues of race, gender, I mean, it's all there. It's all packed into this little area. So I don't have to overtly try and talk about the issues. They're just present in the people and in the situations that inhabit the poems that I write about.
So
yeah, I couldn't agree with Pam more in that poets ought to write about large subjects, but they need to zero in on images and details. Emily Dickinson said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And that implies you get an angle that the reader can focus on.
Well, Pam, you said something that struck me, and about that bringing it down to a level where you're not just simply describing something, but you're trying to catch the almost the emotional and physiological essence of it. And Marvin Bell, I love a lot of his statements about poetry, and one of his was that what people say there are no words for, that's what poetry is for. And you try to take these things and bring them into some focus. So given that we're talking about the world in verse, let's talk about the past couple of years. I mean, I run a poetry reading series, and I haven't seen people in person at that reading series over 2 years now. We're just starting to get back to that. But the pandemic really, in some ways, isolated writers from one another. But at the same time, people said, well, we'll go on to programs such as Zoom or do things online or stream them on YouTube. Kip, you want to talk about that initially, and then we'll have Bill and Pam jump in.
Sure. Yeah, it's weird because while I've been physically isolated from a lot of my peers and colleagues, I've probably met more people in the past 2 years than at any other time in my life, because I've been able to travel through the internet to places that I can't go physically. And just a real good example of this is I was interviewed by a Pakistani poet, a woman, Fiza Abbas Rabbani, terrific Pakistani poet. And she has a YouTube channel where she interviews poets, and she reached out to me. She had bought my book, and I thought she had bought my first book, Tragedy, Ecstasy, Doom, and so on. But it turns out she had bought Clean Coal Burn, which is a book that's so Appalachian centric, that a woman in Pakistan bought this book and was so drawn to the poems and could make connections to the poems that she wanted to interview me over Zoom in Pakistan. That wouldn't have happened probably without the pandemic. So, the pandemic, yeah, it's been awful in so many ways. And as a writer who has, I've had a couple books come out during the pandemic, trying to publicize the books has been a real chore. And I mean, and it creates conflict, because I feel a little skeevy when I'm trying to promote a book in the middle of a pandemic and I can't get the word out as much as I'd like to. And it's like, well, God, there are people suffering all around the world. But all those people who are experiencing suffering in their region of the country, they can reach out to me from Pakistan, from Texas, from Australia, from Scotland, England. I mean, I've made so many connections, and I've been able to read poetry that I probably wouldn't have read before. Seeing the pandemic from this international perspective is been a real gift in a way. We can all commiserate with one another, we can educate one another, and it really does sort of shrink the world. And we've all been doing that through our writing and over the internet.
Pam, you do a lot of traveling. How did the pandemic affect, again, your activity, your writing?
Of course, the pandemic touched everyone to some degree, some more than others. There have been so many tragedies about it. And so travel, like almost no travel, but lots and lots of hiking, lots and lots of thinking. But the pandemic had the benefit of forcing fast change that could not have happened without it. So people suddenly were working from home. That's isolating, but there's a liberation that goes with that too. Not having to drive your car and spend the time in your car, the cost of parking, the cost of eating out, things like that. I found it very hard to write about the pandemic. It's been too huge for me. I've written a few things about it. But I have, like Kip was saying, I've traveled in ways like Zoom, like being a part of the Ohio Poetry Association monthly Zoom readings. Those readings are in Columbus. I never would have driven 2.5 hours for a 1 hour open poetry reading. I just wouldn't have done it. But I could do it, so that every month I could, like, Kip, Bill, you, Steve, meet these people that I never would have met before. I've too been interviewed by someone in California. I'm giving a poetry reading on April 9th by a press in Oregon. It has made this fast change that's been incredibly positive at a deeply negative, upsetting, disturbing time. But some of these changes I hope stick, because I think they're valuable and it's worked for me.
Bill, what did you have to add?
Well, Well, the pandemic, it's almost beyond belief what has happened. We're going for 1 million deaths here in the United States, and what is it, 6 or 7 million across the world, and so I'm still sort of stunned by it. I think I only wrote one poem about the pandemic, and it was very much focused on just how my wife and I were managing, called Lives in Limbo. And I'm not all that active on the internet. So I envy Kip and Pam, their ability to meet more people from around the world. It's one of the great bonuses of Zoom, I think. And I'm glad to be Zooming today. But it can make the world smaller, and that's a good thing.
So I hear, what you just said, Bill, was that in a sense, what you were doing was taking the pandemic and the enormity of it in terms of it affecting so many people all over the world, that you were bringing it down to its immediate personal effect and representing it that way. I'd like to ask each of you just to, at some point here, I'm going to ask you to read a poem. But first, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how writers, or how poets in particular, balance that idea between the personal and what's beyond that. When I was a creative writing instructor, I used to, you would get at the college level, the first couple of years, I taught at Columbus State Community College, you get a lot of I poem. And I used to take a line from Yeats' The Stolen Child, which goes, the world, what is it again? The world is, I'm forgetting the quote, but it's basically, the world is more than you can understand. And the basically was, I had to tell them, yes, but the rest of the line continues and says, basically, it's not about you. That the world is out there. Yes, there's interiority, but the world's out there. How can poets effectively do that? Because poetry has become, in many ways, very popular. People actually go out to it as the way they'd go out to a play or something, which again was not that common 50 years ago. So how do you navigate that middle ground between the personal and the public?
I think it's a crucial issue, and the popularity of selfies. We get a lot of selfie poems, and that people become very preoccupied with their own feelings. And that's part of being a poet. Certainly, that's part of the lyric impulse in particular. But I think poetry has a public function. One of my favorite lines from Robert Penn Warren is, "The world is real, it is there." And it's the poet has the responsibility to sort of look out at the world, to teach people how to see and to respond to what isn't your immediate circle and things you're already familiar with. I have a companion volume that hasn't been published yet called Going Places, which all those poems are set in other parts of the world than the United States. So, and even though my opening section in Steel Valley Elegy is autobiographical, the other two sections certainly move out into the larger world.
Kip, you're looking like you're ready to talk.
Yeah, for me, when I was an undergrad, when I was first starting to write poetry at Ohio State, it was sort of an incredible time at Ohio State. They were bringing in all kinds of terrific writers. And I took like a 2 or 3 week class with Mark Strand, who would come to Ohio State. And he, we got to have one-on-one meetings with him. And so he was reading some of my poems, and he read this one poem called Mine Shaft. And it was about a mine explosion that my grandfather was in. And he got to this one part of the poem, and he's like, yeah, the poem's okay. He's like, but this part, it's really cornball. And I said, well, that's true. That's the truth. That's what happened. And he's like, truth's bullshit. He said, I don't care what really happened. He said, there's different kinds of truth and you have to get to the bigger truth. And that, I mean, as a 21-year-old, blew my mind. And I'm like, wow, other truths to write about. I mean, I don't just have to report what I've seen. And that changed the way I write. And when I write, a lot of times, when I've had books reviewed or people talk about books that I've written, they automatically assume that they're 100% autobiographical. And there was a book that was published several years ago about the mining tradition in poetry. And I didn't even know it, but they had taken one of my poems that had been published and explicated it for this book. And the guy talked about how deeply personal it was because it was talking about the death of my father. And well, my father, he's 88 years old, still alive, lives out in Plain City, Ohio. And what I've started doing is when I write a book, I approach it, a book of poetry, I approach it as a novel. There's a narrative arc. There are characters. I take elements from my life, elements from my biography, elements from my grandfather's life, my father's life, my mother's life, my brother's, sisters, anyone I can think of. I'll pull in elements and I create characters that tell a story. And that's just me. That's how I approach it because I don't want to get bogged down in the truth of the event. I want to try and get at the larger truth of something bigger. Like for Clean Coal Burn, a lot of it has to do with grief, dealing with grief. And for me, that's the larger truth of the book.
I used to tell my writing students, don't let facts get in the way of the truth.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's basically what Strand was saying. Yeah.
And it makes it hard to do persona poems. Pam, why don't you tell us about that middle ground between, the facts and the truth?
Well, when you were asking the question, I don't know why, but suddenly in my mind, I kind of flashed back to President Biden's inauguration and Amanda Gorman standing there. There she is on my TV, looking just glorious. And I suddenly found myself standing, watching her, crying, feeling like, yes, I feel that. Yes, I see that. Yes, I mean, everything was a yes, yes, yes about that. That wasn't my poem. It felt like it was for me. And it was for everyone. So that's like one totally successful kind of poem for me. But I am a lover of fiction and fantasy and magical realism. If I could write a book, I wish I could write, a novel. I don't have it in me. It's too big a canvas for me to work on. I love poetry for being able to capture the one thing. So I may start with a highly personal fact, but then it is in my nature to build around it and to keep creating around it until it moves pretty far from the original personal truth to become something more. I did write, I'm working on a little collection of poems based around blues music. I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And I was working on a traditional blues song, Manish Boy, and suddenly found George Floyd was in that poem. I don't know how he got there, except somewhere in my mind that was deeply important to me. And those two things just came together. So typically some essential me that builds out.
Bill, Kip, you want to add anything to it?
Well, I'm a novelist as well. And I wrote a novel about a fellow named William Wells called Black Snake's Path. And I was very happy with that novel, and it was published, but my agent said, you've done so much work on it, why don't you write a history book about it? And so I then wrote a second book about Wells called William Wells and the Struggle for the Old Northwest. And I think it's very interesting to read the two books side by side, what a novelist will do with that material, and what a historian will do. And of course, as a historian, I was much more locked into the facts. I had to be very, very accurate and footnote what I was doing. But as a novelist, I felt I could get at certain truths I couldn't get at as a historian, because I could sort of unleash my imagination a little more to get at those larger truths that we've been speaking of.
But that's sometimes it seems like the poets aren't allowed to approach poetry like a novelist. People think the poetry has to be more personal, and if it's not really coming from your own personal history, then you're trying to fool somebody. And this happened to me in a creative writing workshop at Ohio State. I don't know if you were there for that, Steve, but I used to write these poems about my grandparents' property in Perry County, Ohio, but I created a kind of magical, realistic environment where there was my grandparents' house that they had built, their retirement home. There was an Indian burial mound in the cornfield that surrounded the house. There was a pond by the house. So I put all of these things there that I could use to bring all the different cultures that are a part of that area together. And so I wrote a series of poems about that. And I submitted them to this creative writing workshop. And one of the other students in the workshop after class, she said, can you take me down there? I really want to see the Indian burial mound. And I said, it's not real. And she was furious. She was so angry. And I said, well, why can William Faulkner create an entire world that's, fictionalized, but based on things? Why is he allowed to do it in a novel? And I can't do it in poetry. That, I don't understand why there's that division. So yeah, I think, and that's one of the things when I used to teach creative writing, I would tell my students, do not assume the I in a poem is the poet, because you can get into real trouble if you make those assumptions.
The I in the poem is not the poet, but someone who knows the poet very well. Huh?
Yes. Yes.
Speaking of topics, yeah, Pam, go ahead.
Well, this is something that I'm struggling with a little bit with these blues poems. So many of the blues music, I'm looking at specific blues songs and blues artists. How does an older white woman not co-opt the experience of, say, a Jimi Hendrix, a B.B. King? So I've been researching a lot and thinking a lot about that. What gives me that? I need to feel right about it. I need to feel it's okay.
It's that struggle about, what is appropriation and what isn't. You get this, my view is there's a lot of crazy stuff going around about appropriation, because I could look at someone like Yo-Yo Ma and say, man, you've appropriated Anglo-Saxon culture, man. And that doesn't make any sense. But I do remember when we were talking about topics, and Pam, I'm going to ask you to read a poem here in just a moment, so you can be ready for that. I read a poem from one of George Bilger's early books, Cleveland poet. I think most of you probably know him. And it was called Wanton Boys. And what it basically was speaking in the first person, speaking about how young boys torturing animals. And at the end, it pivots and goes into talking about young girls. And the last line is something like, they began to bleed before we ever touched them. Young woman came out of the audience right after I read that in an open mic. She said, that book should be burned. Because she didn't get that. Young boys, and young girls in other ways could be pretty horrible, and a lot of people don't want to face that. But at any rate, Pam, let's let's go into any poem you want to read from and let us know what collection it's from and let people hear what this world in verse consists of.
I need my glasses to read, even though
Mhm.
book. So it's from my book Widowmaker. And this really this is it's kind of based in truth. And this, like I said before, this Widowmaker, my husband's cardiac arrest and recovery. And I imagined at the end of his recovery that we traveled to New Orleans. So there was my essential truth. I'm imagining us in one of our favorite cities in New Orleans. It's called Tap Dancing. Zydeco music from buskers on Royale catches your ear. So you pause with all the other tourists just to watch them perform. And even though it's hotter than blazes, you can't peel your eyes away from that sweetheart of a fiddling girl in her cornflower blue dress with little red polka dots. Or is it another pattern? And you edge in close and notice the fabric is flimsy and almost transparent, and it's speckled with ladybugs, a sure sign of good luck. And she's sawing along in time to the old geezer thrumming a washboard with a spoon in each fist, sweat shining on his cheeks and stains drenched along both sides of his work shirt. And he's standing next to a big guy who's squeezing the heart out of his accordion. And then, you can't make this stuff up, a tiny boy throws down a wooden box, no more than a 3x3 square, and slides grubby bare feet into scruffy black shoes, then ties ribbons around ankles that are so skinny, they remind you of your mother's prized china cup. And who knows where that memory came from, because this child's skin is lovely and warm and as brown sugar, and her cup was lily white, and nothing like this beautiful mahogany youngster who jumps onto the box, his feet flailing in. Hot damn if he doesn't have taps on his toes and heels. And the crowd goes crazy. People pulling bills from wallets and purses and tossing cash into the open fiddle case, and you realize they're playing jambalaya, one of your favorites. So you grin at the kid and try to snag his attention, but he is as serious as a heart attack. And that's when you remember how your own heart stopped, even though it always tapped like a champ, never skipping a beat, much less stopping cold. And then the sky splits apart with a soft rain that plunks into the dusty street, and onlookers scatter under awnings, then drift away, but the buskers keep busking, and the kid keeps tapping, and your heart keeps beating, and the whole scene does your heart good, and it pulls on your heartstrings, and it thaws out your frozen, stunned heart, and you feel nothing but glad. So very, very glad.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you. We're talking about the world in verse and how that brings in so many different elements as it goes along. I think can help us lead to this next part. Bill, you said that you don't write in verse in the sense of being metrical. So how do you decide the line, for example?
Well, not to verse, I mean, in a sense, I don't have end rhymes, but I certainly am thinking in terms of the line being a musical unit, and I'm trying to hear how each line goes. And usually the opening line set the pattern for the rest of the poem in one way or another. If my first line is, say, 7 syllables, the subsequent lines are probably going to range from 6 to 8 with maybe a few exceptions. So that more sets up the pattern. But I'm always trying to pay attention to the music of the words and how they relate to each other. And so there's a lot of internal music, I think, in my poems. And that's very important to me. I think, again, the statement I did earlier about you must love language. I mean, for me, that's the key of when poets are good. You can see that they have a special love for language and they use it with great precision.
I find myself often saying, and I edit the Ohio Poetry Association's annual member journal, and as I read through poems, I'll get to some and I'll say, it just doesn't have any music to it. It's nice language and all, but it doesn't fit together. It's almost like being at an open, being at a reading where there's an open mic and someone comes up to the mic and says, I just wrote this while I was sitting in the back. I want someone to come up and cut my throat. It's just no. Kip?
Well, I think when you think of somebody like William Stafford, and people don't necessarily think of Stafford as a musical writer. His stuff is so plain spoken, but there's music all over the place. I mean, just a line from one of his poems, I hear in the chain a chuckle I like to hear. I mean, that's just gorgeous. And Stafford will drop those things in the middle of a poem, and they just come out of nowhere and they explode and they just ripple throughout the whole poem. For me, I think the line is the most important unit of a poem. And the way I try to approach it is to think of the line as a poem within the poem. So your poem, you might have a 16-line poem that's made up of 16 small poems. And so, I've got a poem that I wrote years ago about after my son was born. And so I can read you a sentence that I have. Holding my son, I think of everything I want to give him, everything I've already given him. It's a pretty straightforward sentence, but the lines are, holding my son, I think of everything. I want to give him everything. I've already given him my eyes. Because the next sentence begins with, my eyes study the curve of his mother's body. And the poem is called Inheritance. And it's about all the things my son will inherit from me, all the things he's already genetically inherited from me. And I have horrible eyes. So I wanted to have these little poems within the poem that kind of emphasize there are things that I want him to inherit. There are things I don't want him to inherit, but he's already inherited them, and I have no say in the matter. And so that's what I like to think about when I'm working on a poem. And it's not necessarily the first time I get the poem down. That sort of comes in the revision process, where okay, what can I do now to get music, to get metaphor, something deeper in the poem that isn't necessarily beating somebody over the head, saying, here's what I'm trying to do, but it's there.
This seems a good place to ask you to read a poem for us.
Okay.
Or should I come back to you?
No, it's fine. Well, so, I mean, since you're talking about music in poetry, I listen to music a lot when I'm writing, and or I'll watch TV, and I tend to put on things that have a lot of music in them. And during the pandemic, Ken Burns' documentary about country music came out, fantastic documentary. I've gotten so many great poems from that documentary. And his episode where he depicts the death of Hank Williams really spoke to me. So I wrote this poem, and it's called Lonesome Appalachian Highway, for Hank Williams, who died on the road in the back seat of his car somewhere in West Virginia, January 1st, 1953. I've looked for the moon in the sky all night, through the window frosted, nearly blind with the swirls of my slow breathing. I'd like to think it's crying for me tonight, but somehow I know it's cheating with all the stars I can't see. I know nothing but death can stop the pain that storms like white water over my bones. Every rut in the road rattles through me, the way thunder used to shake the window panes of my childhood Alabama home. Out of the glowing dash up front, I hear myself singing from a lifetime ago. Just like a blind man, I wandered along, worries and fears I claimed for my own. But there's nothing God can give back to me. The light is given into an everlasting night. I didn't think the world could get any colder. I didn't think the snow falling like ashes could blanket me here inside this car, heading north to Ohio and the next show. It's just a matter of time before frostbite finds its way inside and stops my heart cold.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. Bill, why don't you read a poem for us now, and we'll come back around and start looking more at the idea of the personal, the political, the personal, and the global. So, William Healy.
Okay, yeah, since we've been talking about the music of poetry, I think I'll read one, again, that isn't rhyme, but I think generates a significant amount of music within the line. It's called How I Left the War and Took Up Basketball. And it's set back in when I was about 12 years old and the Korean War was going on. And as a kid, I maybe younger than 12, more like 10. As a kid, I thought the Korean War was really neat. And I bought Army surplus gear and we went out in the woods and played soldier. And this is about the point where quite literally I dropped the war and picked up basketball, which I think was a more mature enterprise for at least for many years. So How I Left the War and Took Up Basketball. The first time he whipped a behind the back pass to the open man on his blind side, Bob Cousy knew he was a star. A small man with big hands, quick as a poet, his pinpoint passes scored baskets. Me, I practiced down in our pitch black cement cellar, dribbling with either hand in the dark. Sometimes I sat with my eyes shut, spinning the ball on my fingers, rubbing the nubbles and whispering to myself. This was near the end of the Ohio phase of the Korean War, when coming home at dusk from the Battle of Hidden Valley and Lee Run Creek, I ran head first into a barbed wire fence, slicing my skin at the hairline. My mother screamed to see the web of blood while I searched my skull in the mirror, praying for a scar. At first, I shot from the hip, pushing off on my left leg to launch a giant, banking the ball off the board to drop through the hoop. By junior high, I had a fall-away jump shot and basketballs on the brain.
Nice.
Mhm.
Yes, playing war.
Yeah. Again, the horrors of kids, that at a certain age you don't realize.
Yeah, how our images of things that are horrible can become romanticized.
Mhm.
I'd like for each of you to talk in some form about how writing poetry affects, maybe changes the way that you see the world, even as you're trying to create some representation of it. And I'll take the first volunteer.
Well, I could talk a little bit about early when I started writing poetry. I was taught by Gordon Grigsby, and I know Steve knows Gordon. I don't know how many other people remember Gordon, but he was a fantastic poet, a very hard teacher, but always there was always a political element to everything he did, even in his most beautiful imagistic poems about nature. There was always some sort of political undertone. And I think he got that a lot from William Stafford too. Stafford, same way. I mean, you read Stafford's poetry and he's got the overtly political poems, but a lot of his poetry, there is a kind of subversive politics at work in the imagery. And when I was in high school, my mother and I were both very politically active. They had just, the year I turned 18, they reinstated the draft registration. And so my mother and I were protesting that. There was a Rockwell plant in Columbus where they were building parts for the B-1 stealth bomber, and we used to protest out there. So when they finally unveiled the stealth bomber, I wrote just a very, very short poem that is sort of getting at what I'm talking about, where you can kind of slip the political in without overtly talking about it in the poem. Now, the title of this poem, it doesn't seem to initially match with the poem itself, but it works on kind of a leaping level, sort of Robert Bly's whole concept of leaping poetry. And it's called Unveiling the Stealth Bomber. The sky twirls her blue dress open after rain. How bright the edges of clouds shine, like light framing a loose door. Sumac darkens along the river. Turtles bloom from their shells. High overhead, a buzzard settles in a tree, like the echo of a gunshot.
Mm. Wow.
So that for me is, if you try and write poetry that's just overtly political, it just very rarely does it work. And I think you have to approach it slant, as Steve was talking about earlier, to try and I think have more of a broad impact. And so people don't dismiss it out of hand.
Bill?
Well, I began as a poet back in the 60s. And so needless to say, a lot of the poems were very political and a lot of the poems were very bad. So it takes a while to learn how to discuss political topics with a certain amount of authenticity. And again, I think the key is keeping your eye on the language, not on your moral outrage or whatever it is you want to express, that you have to find concrete images and you have to find specific angles to come at things for political poems to work. But I think it's very important for poets to be political. I think that that's very much part of the poet's job of work. And Wallace Stevens once said it's the presence of the determining personality that you feel in a poem. And I like to think he should have said the presence of a determining sensibility, because that sort of calls attention to a larger aspect of who the poet is and where the poet comes down on the crucial issues of our time.
Pam?
Well, I studied with Hale Chatfield at Hiram College, and then I studied with Maggie Anderson. So I've had some great people that I studied with and heard and so on. But writing poetry sometimes has been the thing that kept me tethered to the world. I don't write a lot of political poetry. I wrote for 20 years about my mother's death from breast cancer. It was one way that I could try to understand the experience and how it related to me and my sisters. 20 years of that. And then I found with the Holocaust poetry, this was something I needed to understand in the world in a different way. And it wasn't enough to just read books about it. I had to write about it. So poetry has just been really essential to me to make sense of things that didn't make sense for me. Not highly political, but big things that others can understand too and can grab onto. It feels like writing is my responsibility somehow, to just for myself, but for my family, for other people who might read it. It just feels essential to me. It feels essential to me because it is essential.
There is that element of learning as you go through the poem, as you try to write a poem, the surprises that come up and how you're actually teaching yourself something. And just recently, there were 5 short poems by William Stafford's son, Kim Stafford, that have been making their way around the internet about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And they're all taken from a Ukrainian perspective. And it's the kind of thing that would very easily become polemical. And they avoid that
10 minutes.
wonderfully. So if I'm sure you can find it on the internet.
Mm.
All right, let's make the last part of our reading discussion here more personal. And what I'd like to ask you is, how has your poetry changed since, let's say, you were in your 20s and 30s to the kind of poetry you're writing now? I mean, what's different, either about the poems or about how you approach them?
Well, I started out, as I say, as a poet in the 1960s, and when I was at Kenyon College, I fell under the influence of Paul Blackburn and other writers that came to Kenyon. And so I had about a 10-year career as writing poems and publishing them. And my first book, The Walking Man, is basically those poems. And then about 1980, I switched over to writing fiction and history and literary criticism, and haven't returned really to writing poetry full time until 2018. So I've had sort of an in-between career as a man of letters of all sorts. I think one of the ways I've changed is that, having written so much narrative novels and history, I'm much more conscious of trying to get my poems to tell a story this time. And so in a sense, they're a little more prosy, and they're a little more deliberately informative as I try to fill in stories and add the storytelling dimension to my general concern with the music of language.
I am much better read. I have, I've come to read more. I am more interested in the news and politics, even though I don't write a lot of political poetry, but I'm more interested in and aware of what's going on in the country and in the world. And a better reader of other poets. I've heard so many more, and I can't help but think that my poetry has been enriched by just aging and understanding things differently, reading others, talking to others, hearing other poets, being very impressed by the poets in Ohio, poets from all over the place. And in my 20s, I didn't read much poetry. I was kind of doing my own thing, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's become deeper. And I also can envision a whole. I don't just look at writing a poem. I kind of have projects in mind. So I'm working on bigger things.
Discovering how the world's increasingly complex.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I didn't start writing poetry until I was in my 20s, and I hadn't read any poetry. Well, Robert Frost, that was that was it before I started writing poetry. And when I did start writing poetry, I had someone in a creative writing workshop at Ohio State say, "Oh, you're just ripping off James Wright." And I'm like, "Who's James Wright?" I had no idea who it was. So I got a book of James Wright, and I was like, "Wow, he's really talking to me." And then I started reading Jane Kenyon's poetry, and she was really talking to me too. And so I started out sort of wrapped up in the deep images stuff. And then after I graduated from Ohio State, I got a job in the Department of Zoology at Ohio State. And I just, it had nothing to do with literature or anything. I got my degree in English, but I got a job in zoology. And so I had this 5-year period where I was just reading poetry and literary criticism and writing. And then I went to grad school. I got my MFA at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And there was this real sort of hatred of the deep imagists. So they were sort of pushing me to write other things. And then I went on to study creative writing for a PhD at Oklahoma State. And they were pushing you even farther, more towards sort of the New York school of writing. And so I just kept, and, Billy Collins was like it. And, it was, so I did that for a long time. And then when I finally found my way back to Ohio, I just sort of looked at everything I had written in that 10-year period. I'm like, man, this stuff's bad. it's really bad. And so I just went back and I started reading the poets, Wright and James Hirschfield and Bly and a lot of foreign poets, Yanis Ritsos, and just the imagery that they were doing just really spoke to me. And so I sort of came full circle and came back to that. But because I had worked in these other sort of forms, it did broaden my horizons, and it then allowed me to come at the imagery from a way I couldn't even conceive when I was younger. So I could write a narrative poem that maybe was comprised more of images. It spoke more a language of imagery, but it worked as a narrative. And that's sort of where I'm at now.
James Wright was an important early influence on my work. And I read him a lot, and he said some very nice things about my first book of poems, The Walking Man, although I never got to meet him personally.
Can I shake your hand just so I can shake the hand of some?
Right.
I've hugged Annie Wright, so I guess that's okay.
Well, all of you, I know, have kind of exemplified in your own work the title of the workshop, that range between things that are touching on what people might consider more global kinds of issues, but also things that are perhaps what many people see as not the stuff of poetry, also writing about the natural world, family, how we can take the world and bring it down to a scale that people can recognize and actually feel a connection to. And which is, the world is more full of weeping than you can understand. And I used to just say, no, the world is more full of weeping than you. And to get students to look outward into the world. So I want to thank all of you, William Heath, Pam Anderson, Kip Knott, for joining us. And I also want to thank the Book Loft of German Village, and remind you that you can get copies of each of these writers' books through bookloft.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Thank you.